so many of you here. You will all know, because I've been going on about it for months now, that Peter Tatchell is probably my all-time hero. So you all know how excited I am. And I know that many of you are sharing my excitement as well. So we are incredibly lucky to get him in. I've managed to keep him to myself for a while, and I've been very starstruck and excited. It's a bit sad, but I have to. So yeah, over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and it's a delight to join you here. In fact, the last time I was in Portsmouth, I think was, well, certainly the second last time I was in Portsmouth was way back in 1987, when the Queen was in the city to send off the replica First Fleet to Australia. And I was in the crowd to highlight the genocide perpetrated against the Aboriginal people of Australia. When the first white settlers went to Australia, there were an estimated 750,000 Aboriginal people. By the 1920s, there were only about 120,000 left. In fact, in the island of Tasmania, all full-blood Aboriginal people had been exterminated by British settlers going on hunting parties to shoot them like rabbits. Plus, of course, the effect of diseases that were brought by the European settlers. The upshot was that even before I could hold up my placard, I was arrested. And I was taken to Portsmouth Police Station and held in the cells for nearly 24 hours, and then appeared in Portsmouth Magistrates Court, where I was bailed to appear a month later on unspecified charges. They were going to dream them up. In the end, the police, I think, realised that it was a very sticky case to make, and that the chance of conviction was probably quite small, given that I'd actually done nothing. So the charges were dropped. But anyway, that's my last but one visit to Portsmouth. I was asked to talk about, since you are the Pride Society here, a little bit about my own background. I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, the capital of the state of Victoria. I was born in 1952. I went to the Australian equivalent of a comprehensive school, a co-ed school, mixed boys and girls. I was one of the group of founding pupils of our school. My family moved from the inner city to the outer suburbs in the early 1960s, and to cope with the influx of new people living in the area, they decided to build a new secondary school. So I was one of 80 founding pupils of the new, what became Mount Waverley High School. And we had a very, very progressive, enlightened headmaster. He encouraged students to be involved in the school. So he, at our request, he responded very favourably to set up a Students' Representative Council, which was quite rare in those days for schools. And we had a really big impact and involvement in running the school and making recommendations to reform the school. We also demand the right to elect the prefect rather than having the prefects appointed by the headmaster and staff. We were allowed to have a student magazine which we controlled, and we could do whatever, more or less whatever we liked, again, which was very, very rare in those days. And one of the issues we championed was to support Aboriginal kids who were forced to leave school at an early age to help support their families. So a lot of Aboriginal kids left school at the minimum leaving age to go out to work to support their families. So a group of us came up with the idea of creating a scholarship fund that would allow Aboriginal kids to stay on at school. So we'd pay them equivalent of a wage to stay on at school and get qualifications. And this is just a group of school students. You know, we were secondary school students, 15 and 16 years old. We set up that scheme. The first thing we organised was a sponsored walk along the beaches in Melbourne. Now, in those days, sponsored walks were entirely new things. This is, I don't think I'd never heard of the idea before, but we dreamt up this idea of walking on the beach, everybody getting a sponsor to pay for it. And we had, I can't remember the exact number, but at least several hundred pupils participated, and we raised an astonishing amount of money. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think it's roughly about equivalent of about £100,000 today, or maybe $100,000 today, which is a lot of money in those days. I ended up leaving school at 16 because also my parents were poor. They couldn't afford to keep me at school, but unfortunately there were no scholarships that I could get, so I ended up going off and working in the design and art department of a big department store. I wanted to do art and design because I couldn't afford to go to university or technical college. I decided to learn on the job, so I was employed in the design and art department of a big store and learned on the job, doing sign writing, logos, windows, interiors, and so on. It was there at the age of 17 that I realized I was gay. Previous at school, I'd fancied girls, and sort of dated some girls. I had no idea that I was gay. But some other pupils in the school thought I might have been gay. And this is a very, very homophobic era in Australia. This was an era when homosexuality was still totally illegal, when you could be jailed for several years, and when you could even be forced to undergo compulsory psychiatric treatment. So it was quite a homophobic atmosphere. But interestingly, although some of the other pupils used to joke, call me Puff to Pete or Peter Pansy, because I was confident in my heterosexuality, or so I thought, it was water for ducks back. I wasn't fazed by it. It wasn't nasty, vicious. It was like just teasing, but good-natured. And I was very popular in the school. And in fact, in my final year at school, at the age of 16, I was voted by all the other pupils as the head boy. So there was a big contradiction between them thinking me being gay, which I wasn't in those days, and me being very popular. And there's a famous, in the summer in Australia, it's standard for boys to wear shorts and long socks. And I used to get lots of wolf whistles from other boys, because I apparently had the best legs in the school, they said. I remember once I went to the gym room to get some equipment and found two of my fellow pupils having sex. I was a bit shocked, but I just thought, well, that's not for me, but that's fine, no one's harming anybody else. And it's amazing that, apparently I learned later that other pupils knew about this, but everybody seemed to have a live and let live attitude. And where that came from, I don't know, because the predominant culture was very, very homophobic. So I said I didn't realize that I was gay until I was 17 when I worked in the department store, and that was because I met other gay people. And previously at that time, I always thought gay people were dirty old men in Macs who molested young boys. That was my idea of a homosexual, because that was the only image I ever had. Because you'd see these stories in the paper occasionally about men in their 50s and 60s who'd expose themselves to young boys, or forced young boys to have sex with them. And that's the only reportage there ever was about gay people. So it was a very negative view. Then when I worked in the department store, I met other people my own age who were gay, and very nice people, and that eventually enabled me to sort of come to the realization that I was gay. I was very lucky that I met someone at my workplace who was gay, and we ended up falling in love and having a relationship. So I didn't have any traumas at all. For me, it was a very, very easy thing. I didn't have to go around clubs or bars or public toilets or parks searching for sex or partners. I met this wonderful guy who we are still now best friends all these years later, and we ended up having a wonderful relationship for a number of years. In terms of my activism, I can remember in that year, when I was 17, 1969, in the latter part of the year, I read some small report in a local paper saying that, said something like, last night thousands of homosexuals marched through New York to demand civil rights. That's all it said, just a little tiny news in brief. I remember reading that and thinking, yes, I want to do that. I think we need to do something to challenge the prejudice and discrimination, the persecution that gay people face. But of course in Melbourne in those days, there were no gay organisations, there were no helplines, no counselling services, absolutely nothing. All there were 2 seedy bars, there were no clubs, no cafes, no restaurants, nothing. So I decided, what can I do? I asked other friends, including the gay friends at work. They said, you're crazy. What do you know? You're only 17. You'll get us all arrested. Go away. So all I could do was think, well, at least I can write letters to the newspapers. So when there were homophobic stories, I would write letters to the local newspapers, or the main newspapers for the city of Melbourne. And initially I was too scared to sign my name, let alone give my address, because I feared, they might be handed over to the police and I'd get arrested. So gradually over months I began to sign my name and eventually even include my address. I'm not too sure it had any effect, but I did what I could in those circumstances. Then I left Australia in 1971 and came to London. I'd always wanted to travel, but the main reason I left was because I was opposed to Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. And I disagreed with the war. I thought it was unjust and immoral. I wasn't prepared to go to Vietnam because Australia had the draft at the time. And if you stayed and refused the draft, you could be jailed for 2 years. So I decided to leave the country and I came to London not long after the Gay Liberation Front was established in Britain. And in fact, on the second day I was in London, by the way, I came by boat via the South Pacific, the Panama Canal. It took about seven weeks. I got the cheapest, I came on with my boyfriend. We got the cheapest cabin available and D deck, way below the water line, right by the front. We'd be the first to be killed if there was a crash in an iceberg or anything like that. Anyway, we arrived in London at Southampton, and I can remember the train journey from Southampton to London. I was horrified on that train journey because, particularly coming into London, there was all the grey slate roofs. It looked like something out of Dickensian England. Someone had come from Australia. It was quite shocking. Anyway, the second day in London, I saw a sticker on a lamppost advertising the meetings of the Gay Liberation Front. So just a few days later, I was at my first meeting, and within a month, I was helping to organise some of the spectacular protests that they organised in those early days. In 1972, in the early part of the year, we decided to set up a gay pride event. It had never been done before in Britain. I don't even think by that stage, it might have been done in one or two cities in the United States the previous year, but certainly not in Britain. So the idea was to have a gay pride march and rally to counter the idea that the popular view was that gay people were mad, bad, and very sad. So our slogan was "Gay is good," and those 3 words were revolutionary because they turned on its head the popular conception that gay was very bad. So we organised, I said, a rally and march, and we started at Trafalgar Square and then marched to Hyde Park for a gay day in the park. In other words, a picnic in the park. In those days, to our surprise, 700 to 1,000 people turned out. This is an era when homosexuality is still being criminalised. That was quite a surprise because most people in those days were closeted. They wouldn't dare ever say they were gay, let alone appear and say so in public. So we had 700 people. I can remember there was a police officer for virtually every marcher. There were about 700 police for 700 marchers. And they treated us like criminals, which of course we still were, largely. And They openly abused us, using insulting words, because the police could get away with it in those days. Anybody could get away with it in those days. But we held our Gay Pride parade, and that was a milestone because it never happened before. And in fact, the first ever gay rights protest had only taken place a few months before, in November 1971, when the Gay Liberation Front went to Highbury Fields in London to protest against police harassment of the gay community. The leader of the Young Liberals, Louis Eakes, had been arrested in Highbury Fields, allegedly loitering to meet other men. If a straight man was loitering to meet a woman, he wouldn't get arrested. But in those days, and until fairly recently, that still happened to men. Anyway, that was the first ever gay rights protest in Britain. Obviously, since that first time, gay pride parades have got bigger and bigger and bigger over the decades. So that by 1997, in a period when there were still all the anti-gay laws were in place, by 1997, the Gay Pride Parade in London had over 100,000 people on the march and 300,000 at the Gay Pride Festival on Clapham Common. So a lot of progress made. Still the parades take place every year, usually at the end of June or beginning of July. They usually go from Baker Street down through central London to Trafalgar Square, where there's a rally and concert. So a mixture of artists performing and speeches from politicians, campaigners, and so on. I think I'll probably finish there, so give you plenty of time for questions and answers. So gives you a little bit of flavour of how I began my campaigning. Thank you. So questions from you?
Obviously, it's very clear that you felt that campaigning spirit very, very early on, even as a very young teenager. But what keeps you going now, when so much progress has been made? There is clearly still much to do, but what keeps you going now? After so long in the game, as it were.
I thought I should start by saying what first made me politically aware.
Oh, okay.
I was growing up in the 1960s, at a time when the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States was on the nightly news. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, the Black Power movement. Those people were challenging segregation in the Deep South. So in the southern states of America, in lots of places, there were beaches reserved for white people, there were parks reserved for white people, the fronts of buses and trains were reserved for white people. There was segregation like it existed in apartheid in the United States right up until the mid-1960s. So I was growing up seeing the images of those protests, and the thing that really hit me was in 1963, white racists threw a bomb into a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 young girls. And I can remember, I was 11 years of age at the time. I remember thinking to myself, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in a church on Sunday morning? How could they do that? I was absolutely appalled and horrified. And that prompted an interest in the Black Civil Rights Movement. I mean, I was brought up in what people would probably describe as a evangelical Christian family. So my Christian faith enabled me to relate to Martin Luther King, who was a Baptist minister. And I began to follow the Black Civil Rights Movement and what they were doing and how they did it. And of course, those ideas and those methods have stayed with me all these years. I saw them as very effective ways of making change. So when Black Civil Rights Movement, they sat in at lunch counters that refused to serve black people. They went to beaches that were reserved for white people and swam. They refuse to sit at the front, refuse to sit at the back of the bus or in the segregated parts of trains. Those tactics of non-violent civil disobedience, much of course inspired by Mohandas Gandhi, those are the kind of tactics that have stayed with me ever since. In terms of your question, I worked out at the age of 17 in 1969 that it would probably take about 50 years to win lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender equality. Looking at the example of the black civil rights struggle and how long it took them, I thought probably about 50 years. And it turned out to be almost right, almost right. So right from the outset, I was in it for the long haul. Of course, I never intended to be a full-time campaigner. You know, my love was art and design, as I said. You know, that's my real passion. But you know, I'd been doing part-time activism from the age of 15 onwards. At the age of 15, in the state of Victoria, there was still the death penalty. So in 1967, when I was 15, a man called Ronald Ryan, a prisoner, was due to be hanged for allegedly shooting dead a prison warder during an escape. Now, I worked out at the age of 15 that based on the autopsy report of the trajectory of the bullet through the warder's body, almost certainly Ronald Ryan could not have shot him. Ronald Ryan was over there, the warder was over here, Ryan allegedly turned and shot dead the warder. But the trajectory of the bullet was through the upper back and out through the lower abdomen. So how could that happen? I mean, it could have deflected off a bone, I guess, but you know, it seemed very, very implausible. Plus, there were other eyewitnesses who said they didn't think that he'd fired the fatal shot. And even one warder who said that he thought the warder had been shot accidentally by another warder on one of the watchtowers. But he was hanged anyway. So I was involved in the campaign to try and save him on the basis there was a reasonable doubt about his guilt. But we didn't succeed. He was hanged anyway. And that really, I just thought to myself, you can't trust the police. You can't trust the judges. You can't trust the government. They're willing to hang a man where there's a reasonable doubt about his guilt. So that provoked a lifelong skepticism of authority. From that moment onwards, I never trusted what anybody in authority said. I didn't necessarily reject it, but I said you have to challenge it, you have to question it, you have to doubt it, you have to demand the evidence. So it's the combination of all those things that sort of sustained me. You know, the knowledge that it was going to be a long struggle, a long, persistent, consistent campaign would be required. I thought to myself, well, if I'm lucky in my 60s, I might see it. And sure enough, in this country, I mostly have.
Did you ever tell your parents you were gay? And what was the relationship?
Well, as I said, my parents were right-wing evangelical Christians. My father was a factory worker. My mother was a housewife, although she worked also in a factory part-time occasionally. They were quite right-wing. You know, for them, as was the popular view in Australia at the time, anybody with liberal views was a communist. And in those days, you could be sacked from your job for being a communist. And I was nearly sacked from my job at the department store for being seen on a protest against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. So, in my parents' view, they were not political at all. They weren't interested. All they were interested in the church and the family. They had no social engagement whatsoever. For them, the worst sins were sex outside of marriage and homosexuality, and then perhaps murder and rape. You know, it was a very, very zealous puritanical morality. So, for them, to be gay was just absolutely, totally shocking. So I knew that they would potentially have a very bad reaction. I feared that if I told them, they would report me and my boyfriend to the police. We could end up being in prison. So initially I didn't tell them. But what I did do was drop hints. Like I would say things like, if there was some item on the news, so there's a paper in Melbourne that particularly had, it was like the worst of the news of the world. It would do all these exposés of gay vicars and gay men caught in public places or whatever. And occasionally I would say, I think that's really disgusting, printing that kind of story, giving someone's name and address. You don't have to agree with what he did, but or I'd say that, I heard about there was a gay rights protest in America. Don't you think, Mum, that gay people shouldn't be persecuted? But over a period of time, gradually, they began to put one and one together to get two. So eventually, I didn't tell them until I was 21, I think, 21. And then they were a bit upset, but they could sort of deal with it because they'd sort of been prepared. They'd been sort of conscientized to the idea about gay people, and I'd challenged lots of their perceptions. And they, to this day, well, my father's just died a few years ago, but my mother still died, but they always said that was the best way to do it. That they could not have, if I'd just come out with it at the age of 17 and told them straight away, they would not have been able to cope. They said they wouldn't have reported me to the police. I'm not entirely sure about that, but they said they would. But they said they would have gone to pieces, and my mother said she would have had a nervous breakdown or something. So she thinks it was a very gentle, kind way to come out. And of course, coming out shouldn't be an act of revenge. It's not about humiliating anybody or confronting someone. It should be about sharing and making them feel comfortable and able to accept the reality. So I think that drip effect did work, and I've suggested to quite a few other people in similar circumstances, like people today in devoutly Muslim or Christian or Jewish families as a strategy, and they've used it and they've had the same result. It's their parents and other brothers and sisters and so on have been able to adjust and cope with it much better than if they'd simply blurted it out.
What were some of the hardest things you had to overcome, and what do you think is your greatest accomplishment?
It's very hard to identify any one thing because I've been involved in so many campaigns. I just had an email today from a Brazilian journalist who wants to interview me about my successful campaign to expose a Nazi war criminal who escaped justice at the end of the Second World War. Because he was doing experiments on gay prisoners in Buchenwald and Neuengamme concentration camps on the order of Heinrich Himmler, the British and American authorities, who actually had him under arrest after the end of the war, basically let him go because they thought he was doing very commendable work. Of course, we want to eradicate homosexuality. And of course, after the war, in our own NHS, publicly funded research was going on in this country to eradicate homosexuality. And on the NHS, gay men were being forced, and some, I think maybe one or two lesbians, forced to undergo various forms of aversion therapy to supposedly cure their sexuality. And the extreme forms, this involved strapping a man, it was usually a man, into a chair, then showing them heterosexual pornographic images, nothing happened, then showing them gay pornographic images. Showing them gay pornographic images and then giving them electric shocks, electrocuting people, Or another variation was giving them nausea-inducing drugs, and then showing them gay pornographic images so they'd vomit and defecate. And the idea was to make an association between homosexuality and unpleasant, nasty experiences. It didn't work, but it did, screw up a lot of people. Who made them impotent, made them emotionally dysfunctional, couldn't have any further relationships with either men or women. Do we need to finish now? Or?
I'm afraid so. I'm gutted. We did. Thank you so much.
If you are interested in these issues and other related issues, because I do a lot of human rights issues, not just gay ones, but other ones as well, please go to our website, petertatchellfoundation.org. petertatchellfoundation.org. And in the top right-hand corner, there's a little tab called Join Us. So you click on there and you can sign up to receive the email bulletins, or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. So think about that. I'm going to leave with Joe a copy of this leaflet called It's Okay to Be Gay, which we handed out in schools in the early 1990s when Section 28 existed, which prohibited schools from discussing gay issues. Created a huge furor at the time. I think if you read it, nowadays, it looks just perfectly sensible and reasonable, what every school should be discussing.
Right, thank you so much, guys, for coming. Thank you so much, Peter. I don't know about you, that seemed to go really quickly, and I wish we had more time. I'm definitely going to be trying to get Peter back at some stage. Those of you who are in the sixth form, I think most of you are able to join us periods 7 and 8 in the DR